Hello, and welcome to Nostalgic Medicine, where we take a look at fascinating stories about the history of medicine and healthcare. Today's video will be on the history of phrenology. So imagine if you can tell a lot about a person by just looking at their external features. Sounds a lot like palm reading or tongue reading or horoscopes to you, right? But I want to tell you today about a method which was actually accepted by some mainstream scientists in the 19th century, which actually shares a lot in common with these things. I'm of course talking about phrenology, which a lot of people have actually heard about, and I want to show you how it was developed and how it was able to impact the way we think about the brain. So phrenology was an attempt to determine a person's personality and traits by measuring the size of the bumps on different parts of your skull. We now consider phrenology to be a pseudoscience alongside things like anti-vaxxers and flat earthers, but the people who did develop it were very respected doctors and scientists in their own right, and actually did try to do their best and develop phrenology based on their extensive knowledge on human physiology. The person that it all began from, and who we can give credit to developing phrenology, was an Austrian doctor called Franz Joseph Gall, who by the way had no relation to the gallbladder, despite the name. So this man went to medical school in France, and he made some quite strange observations. He found that the brightest of his classmates that had the best memory seemed to have very prominent eyes, and to Gall this meant that the part of the brain responsible for good memory had to be located right behind the eyes. I think you'll agree with me that this is very anecdotal evidence to base the whole medical field on, but this was enough for him. So Gall decided to do further investigation to see whether he could correlate other parts of the brain with other personality traits. So Gall got to work during the late 1790s, and he spent thousands of hours taking measurements from the skulls of various people, such as artists, psychiatric patients, and criminals, which he got granted access to because of his close relationship with Vienna's chief of police. And after measuring hundreds of skulls, he came up with a few principles about phrenology. The first principle was that the brain wasn't just a single entity, but that it was actually divided into 27 organs, as we can see here in this drawing. Each organ was responsible for a specific personality trait, and the size of the organ corresponded to how strong of the trait you had, because you used the organ more. And in order for you to determine the size of the organ, Gall said that you could look at the size of the bumps of the skull overlying each organ, since you obviously couldn't just open the skull and look into the brain. Some phrenologists measured the size of bumps by just sight or a simple ruler, whereas others used more complex devices like these craniometers. Gall's ideas about phrenology immediately got some followers, and by 1810 they began to spread these ideas all over Europe via open lectures, which, believe it or not, was a form of entertainment at the time. But despite this, it wasn't actually really accepted by most scientists, as they weren't convinced by his evidence. But this didn't matter, because a lot of the general public did accept Gall's findings and packed his lectures, probably because the early 19th century was a period of enlightenment, where many people were very open to new ideas about how the human body and many other natural phenomena worked. Phrenology was also quite a logical sounding alternative to the religious teachings that were popular at the time, that stated that your personality is within your soul, which is a non-physical entity which can't be measured. So the field of phrenology had grown massively by 1820, with a phrenology society being established that had thousands of respected members, as well as regular journals being published. And thanks to Gall and his followers, phrenology started to find its way into mainstream medical practice, as the doctors who supported it began to use it in their practice in many various ways. Some applications included advising on career choice or marriage partner based on personality. Or you can use phrenology to modify the style of education for children based on what suits their personality and preferred style of learning. Phrenology even had a positive effect on criminals. Most criminals, of course, were said to have a large part of the brain that was responsible for criminal behaviors, but instead of punishing people for this, they were encouraged to exercise this brain energy into similar but productive non-criminal things, such as becoming a butcher or working with executioners so that they could witness killings. So this definitely was a relatively humane way of dealing with criminal behavior compared to other practices at the time. And I obviously can't continue without mentioning therapy, as therapists were able to tailor their techniques to best suit a client's personality. But phrenology also had a few negative uses for it. People used it to justify excluding women from aspiring towards a successful career, as the organs necessary for success in the arts and sciences were meant to be underdeveloped in women, whereas women had larger organs related to the care of children and religion. People also used it to justify their racist beliefs, saying things like black people's head had more similarities with apes than with white people. In fact, some people have argued that phrenology was a factor that led to the Rwandan genocide, which killed 500,000 people, because when Belgian colonists came over to Rwanda, phrenology was one of the things that they used to divide the Hutu and Tutsi tribes, and this inevitably increased the tension between them, thus starting off the set of events that would lead to the genocide. Phrenology would ultimately fall out of favour in Europe and America during the mid-1850s, as scientists were not able to replicate Gall's claims, based on things like observation on people who had things like brain damage or tumours, and they concluded that what Gall was doing was basically just guesswork. But even though we now think of phrenology as just a fringe pseudo-scientific theory, you might be surprised to hear that it was actually very influential to modern science. This is because Gall can be credited as being the first person to ever suggest that different parts of the brain have different functions, just not in the way that Gall thought it did. For example, as you can see here, the back of the brain is responsible for processing vision, and the front is for thinking and planning. So that's a brief history of phrenology, which came and went as a medical theory quite quickly in the grand span of things, but it was very influential at its time, and it did help to completely change the way that we think about the brain forever.